Hi, everybody. David Nour. I want to welcome you to another episode of our Curve Benders Live. I'm delighted you're here. We're broadcasting live on LinkedIn and Facebook and YouTube and Twitter. I do this each week with my Curve Benders podcast guest, and I'm elated this week to be joined by our Marshall Goldsmith MG100 friend, Diane Ryan. Hello, Diane.
Hi, David. Great to be here with you today. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Of course, it's great to have you, Diane. We did our podcast this morning, and I was really moved by your story of Splendid Torch. So that's what I titled it. But for our audience who may not know as much about you, give us a glimpse of where your decorated background, where you've been, what you've done, and a little about your current role now.
Sure. So I spent 29 years, almost 30 years in the Army, which was a really sort of unexpected journey for me. When I started college, it was really expensive. I had to figure out a way to pay for it. So I walked over to the ROTC building and got myself a 3-year scholarship, and fully intended to either do the reserves or maybe just do one tour and then go into the civilian or corporate world. And something happened to me in my first assignment that sort of lit a spark. And I made a deal with myself that I would stay in the Army for as long as it continued to be fun and I would have the opportunity to learn new things. And so 29 years later, I found myself thinking about what would be next after that, because after 30 years, they more or less kick you out. Midway through, I was on a combat tour in Iraq, and I ran into what would soon be one of my closest colleagues from West Point, who said, I talked about, I'm going to retire probably in the next 4 years or so. And he said, have you ever thought about teaching at West Point? Because we had these common interests about civil society and, what the well-being of people. And it was a really intriguing idea to me. And the more I thought about it, the more I felt called really to teach, and thought, hey, this could be a big thing for me to do in my life. So I was very fortunate to be accepted on the faculty there, got sent to do a PhD in psychology, and then taught for almost a decade on the faculty and staff in behavioral sciences and leadership. So as I was approaching that retirement age and knowing that, that there was a shelf life to my Army career, I thought about what would I love to do next? And, there were so many different things, but I knew it had to be something that was consistent with what my skill set was and what my interests were, and most importantly, what my values were. And I happened to be working on this research project with some colleagues from Tufts University, and one day, one of the researchers talked about the West Point mission of developing leaders of character. And she said, the Tufts mission is very similar to that. We develop active citizens for, who will change the world. And so that planted a seed. And then this job became available to be the associate dean at the Jonathan M. Tisch College of Civic Life, which is a really unique organization that serves all of Tufts University in anything related to civic engagement, and sort of strengthening democracy. And it just all fell into place. I feel like I was in the right place at the right time with the right people around me and vouching for me and being champions. And so I've been at Tufts for not quite 4 years, and it's been a great seamless transition.
So number one, thank you for your service all those years. Number two, I'm really curious, probably like most of our audiences, if you've ever met a military academy graduate, Diane, they're incredibly sharp. They're well-educated. They're well on their way to some fabulous leadership opportunities. In thinking about your career, almost like a decade at West Point, what were the biggest leadership challenges you ran into? What did you believe had to be really emphasized or elevated or enhanced in the lives of those cadets as future leaders?
So the military academies, just like the military writ large, is drawing its members from from our society. So they come from a lot of very diverse places with a diverse set of experiences, possibly different value sets, although I would say that people are generally service oriented. So trying to get all those people to come together in a cohesive way and work as a team sometimes is a little bit challenging. Trying to get people to internalize the Army values in a timely way was also a little bit challenging. It's probably no secret to people to look at what the three biggest things, I would say, issues that are impacting readiness right now of the force are around racism and bias, sexism, sexual assault, sexual harassment, and mental health issues as well. So I feel like there's some smaller issues about getting people all to be rowing together on the same team, but also tackling these larger societal issues as well. I mean, the things that happen in the military do not happen in a vacuum. They're a reflection of what happens in society. So figuring out how to balance those things and solve problems, both in coordination with what's happening in our environment, but also specific to the values and the policies and the doctrine of the military. I think you're familiar with the term VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. I mean, that's kind of been our calling card for the last 20 years or so. So teaching people how to think, not necessarily what to think, is all at the core of that.
I want to get to your work at Tisch and at Tufts in a second. How do you believe, I want to stay in the military because, again, such a great background.
Sure.
How do you believe the soldier of the future, that military leader of the future needs to evolve? Talk about 2 or 3 things that they got to really think about and do differently in the evolution of our military forces.
I don't know that it's necessarily any, I think there's going to be a lot of technological changes that we're going to have to figure out how do we manage those, and how do we best utilize and leverage them. That's nothing new. It's certainly been a challenge for probably my entire time since I joined. So I think leveraging technology to improve readiness is important, but also not losing sight of the human factors as well and taking care of people. We need to be really careful about technology, media that divides, and make sure that it doesn't infect us. And there are certainly concerns for that that need to be addressed. And I think that the services were taken to task when Lloyd Austin became Secretary of Defense. Not to say that there weren't great people that have been doing this work all along, but we're definitely trying to shine a light on some of these issues right now, and recognize that the human element is every bit as important as the technological element. So you have to have them in balance.
You mentioned the military as a reflection of the society. One of the things you and I have talked about is the diversity and equity and inclusion. Certainly it's been important for a long time. In some places, Diane, I can't help but feel like it's lip service, right? We talk about it because it's interesting. I'm really interested in your lens of what did you see in your time in military that actually worked in creating more of a diverse and inclusive environment for those less representative groups?
I think having the tough conversations and willing to be vulnerable with people really works. I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, everything comes down to good leadership. And I was the beneficiary of tremendous leadership. Every time there's a scandal that happens and something bad happens, I'm often stopped by people on the street or, that I come into contact with who don't have military experience and ask me like, oh, this is so terrible. Like, do you have firsthand experience with that? The most obvious of these is sexual harassment and assault. And I truly believe that the good leadership that I was the beneficiary of, and the people that were very outspoken about like, this will not be tolerated, and people who engage in these behaviors will be held accountable, was a protective factor. There's no question about it. It was a protective factor. So we need more leaders to kind of be courageous in that way, to be outspoken. So you may have seen recently, and I'm, not to be overly political, but Tucker Carlson just raised a lot of hackles with his comments about pregnant women in the force. So I had 2 kids while I was on active duty.
Yeah.
Now, my first child was born when I was in school, so it wasn't really a readiness issue because I was in school. My second child, I got pregnant while I was in another school. But then I went to the force, and I ended up deploying. I would have deployed when she was not quite a year old. And then for operational reasons, our deployment got moved a year. So she was 18 months old when I actually left for Iraq. Other than at that time, you got 6 weeks of maternity leave. Other than my 6 weeks of maternity leave, and the fact that I couldn't take a fitness test for, maybe from the time I was diagnosed with pregnancy, to 6 months afterwards, my brain still worked. Like, I still contributed. I literally, with my second child, I worked up until the day I went to just a routine hospital appointment, and they said, all right, we're going to induce you this afternoon. And I went, no, I have a really important meeting. Like,
can I get back to you on that?
Yeah, no, I'm not advocating that for people. I mean, people need to take care of themselves and listen to their bodies. And I'm certainly not, but I'm pointing out that like women are still productive and important to, getting things done. And, this is all sort of a very circuitous route back to your question about diversity and inclusion, and what it's important. And it's important to recognize that we have lots of untapped talent in our country. And it's important to be able to recognize that talent, properly utilize that talent, provide incentives for people to retain and to, continue in service. And sometimes that's in uniform, sometimes that's continuing in service out of uniform. So good leadership is essential to that.
So we have a question and I would encourage our audience to jump in. So Mira wants to know, and this is another one of those incredibly difficult and complex questions, but it's a challenge that we got to address, I think, more broadly in our society as well. Could you talk about how did you tackle mental health with the cadets, but also, Diane, your own? I mean, you and I talked about this. You and I've got kids. I cannot imagine all-inclusive kind of all-in military life with kids. And you mentioned an incredibly supportive husband that kind of becomes your partner in life. But talk about mental health, both how did you practically deal with the cadets and then your own as well?
Yeah, so that's a wonderful question. Thank you, Mira, for asking that. Removing the stigma is the number one most important element here. And I know certainly in my early days of the service, people believed that if you admitted any kind of weakness, and particularly around mental health, that this was an automatic reason to lose your security clearance, for example, or that you would somehow no longer be, physically ready to be able to deploy or do whatever. I will tell you that I had a couple of life events that caused me to have some mild depression that required, I really wanted to talk to someone about it. And I had this initial reluctance, but my undergraduate degree was in psychology. So I sort of understood the importance of if something doesn't feel right, you should go and talk to someone about it and get some help. So there were 2 or 3 times over the course of my career where I personally went to counseling, said, I'm not eating right, I'm not sleeping, I feel pretty crappy, I don't have interest in things. What could this be? And, it doesn't take a rocket scientist. Like, I had some mild depression going on. I've certainly had soldiers that have had not only depression, but, larger issues than that. And certainly we see what the hidden wounds of war of the last, I can't believe I'm saying this, 20 years have manifested on people. I think we've made some advances towards removing stigma. And I think the 2010s were a period. One of my former bosses and mentors was Vice Chief of Staff of the Army. He took this on kind of as his personal mission. We got the security clearance form changed where it became permissible for you to seek mental health treatment for a number of things that were related to stressful situations. And then we've tried to handle people with larger or more significant issues in a really empathetic and respectful way. So when I'd get in front of my classroom and I'd talk, we'd have, I used to teach intro to psychology for many years. We'd have one lesson on psychological disorders. We would devote a lot of time talking about anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress, because those are things you're most likely going to see that are sort of work-induced challenges to people. And we wanted cadets to be able to recognize those signs and symptoms and know what to do about it. So I'd always be very open about my own experiences and what it sort of took for me to reach out and say okay, I'm going to get help on this before I have a psychotic break or something. Because if you don't treat some of those things, I was depressed. So what would happen if I got deeply depressed and started to have self-harming thoughts or other things like that? I didn't want it to get to that. So, how do you relate? Hey, these are good signs that you should probably talk to somebody and share this burden. And I would say in each one of those situations where I was in some kind of counseling, I was always used to being the person who was that, the strong person for others, right? So soldiers would come to me, family members would come to me, they'd want to tell me things and look for advice and help. I didn't want to burden other people with that. This was a big part of my own issues, was feeling like I'm supposed to be the strong person and I'm not going to go and tell people who I know have their own burdens, that I feel sad or that I can't eat anything. So it felt really good to just, kind of pay a stranger to do it. And by pay, I mean, I didn't pay them. It was their job. You know what I'm saying? So there's some leaders now that are being quite open about their own struggles with mental health that I really applaud. There was recently something published. I can't remember what the medium was, but a really high-ranking person that I knew very well several years ago talked about a struggle with bipolar disorder. Mm-hmm. and talked about here's what happened to me. And it was devastating what happened to him. But then he sought treatment and got well. And he wanted to let people know that this was my journey. And I thought that was so unbelievably courageous. Mm-hmm. And people need to be vulnerable and admit that they're human and admit that they need help,
Let's build on that for a second.
Sure.
Unfortunately, the VA, also, you kind of hear a lot of the challenges. And I got to tell you, for as powerful, as capable our country is, mm-hmm. in some ways, forgetting or neglecting those who have served just seems incredibly disappointing. Mm-hmm. So talk about a couple of things. You're a consumer of the VA experience. Mm-hmm. Talk about a couple of things the VA does really well. And what do you believe are opportunities for it to improve as an organization?
Sure. I certainly don't believe myself to be an expert on the VA. I have generally had good experiences, but very superficial. So, I'm embarrassed to admit I don't have my disability rating yet because I've just been too busy to fill out the paperwork. We got our shots over there for COVID, which was amazing, and it was really, really efficient. My understanding is that, the systems are separate. There's like the big VA, and then there's more regional systems that are, again, very dependent on good leadership. Mm-hmm. So in the systems that have great leadership, like I think the hospital that's around the corner from my house has great leadership. So it's run really well and it's very efficient, and they have lots of resources and opportunities. It's also a huge organization, right? I think it's the largest of all of the government kind of cabinet positions or whatever. So, how do you, instill culture change in something that large, so entrenched in bureaucracy? It's not going to happen. I've known three of the last 4 secretaries, I think, or I don't know, maybe 5, because I can't keep track of the ones in the last administration as well. But I knew the 2 secretaries from the Obama administration, and I am an acquaintance of the current or the pending secretary. The 2 in the Obama administration are phenomenal leaders, like people I'd follow anywhere. The first one was Eric Shinseki, and the second one was Bob McDonald, former CEO of Procter & Gamble, both West Point graduates, and both, tremendous human beings who I respect greatly. And I know that they both, did the best that they could do. And they were confronted with tremendous challenges, and none of these issues are going to be solved overnight.
Understood. So it's a complex one that it also sounds like a cultural change is much kind of needed in that transition. So let's talk about Tisch.
Yeah.
Tell us a little about the school, its mission, and what are you most excited about? What, a year or 2 in the job already?
Oh shoot, no, it's more than 3 years now. It goes by ridiculously fast. So Tisch College is, we just had our 20th anniversary last summer, unfortunately in COVID, because the year was supposed to be all these celebrations and all these amazing things that we ended up mostly doing virtually. But it's the only organization of its kind, really. So if you think about other universities that have a Center for Public Service or Institute for Community Engagement or things like that, where all of those things on steroids, I would say. So we have a dean who is equivalent to all of the other school and college deans at Tufts, sits on the president's cabinet. But what's unique about Tisch is we have responsibility or, programs, opportunities for every single student at Tufts. So when my dean is asked, how many students do you have? He says 11,500, because those are all of the undergraduates and graduate students at all of the professional schools who have the opportunity to sort of chart their own civic pathways. And that's the terms that we use, because we recognize that particularly with undergraduates and even for the professional schools, people are coming from all over. They've had different experiences. They got different strengths. They have different interests. And how do we link them up with the most meaningful, impactful, transformational set of experiences for them to move the needle? So we have sort of 3 overarching goals that we look to increase within each student, and really among faculty and community members as well. But we take an ecological approach, and we think about civic identity, civic leadership, and civic agency. So civic identity is, what are the knowledge, skills, abilities, strengths that I bring as a person that I can, share with the world? And how important is it for me to be, an active citizen? And then civic leadership are about those social interactions. So how do I influence others or work collectively with a team towards some goal, that mutually agreed upon goal? And then civic agency is, how do you do that at the macro level? And what does each person need to understand about structures and bureaucracy working inside and outside of them to achieve some kind of positive social change?
So ever since you and I were in school and we studied topics or subjects, and that economic model is always back of our minds, right? So once I finish school, how do I go get a job and rise through the ladder and the ranks and really earn a decent living? Is my economic well-being and my economic prosperity in conflict with my ability to create impact in my civil community?
That's a fantastic question. And I would say the answer to that is no. Like, really, ideally, you would have both. That's what we're trying to impart upon students is, what is it that Mark Tursick says, doing well by doing good, or doing good by doing well. I can't remember. It's one of those things, right? But it's, how do you make sure you're living your values in your profession and making decisions that benefit the greater good?
Can you give us an example?
Sure. I mean, the whole ESG movement, right, is the perfect encapsulation of that. It's making deliberate choices that are not bad for people, right? It's valuing other things alongside of doing well financially. And if you put those things at the forefront, you will likely reap greater benefits materially.
Do you believe that purpose-driven mindset is also driving a lot of the leadership agenda, a lot of the leadership conversation? So CEO of Patagonia has been a huge proponent of the great outdoors. The BlackRock CEO talking about, we have more than just shareholders, we have stakeholders, and we've got to really think about our civil responsibility. Ed Bastian here in Atlanta, Delta, publicly announcing that we're going to reduce our carbon footprint and we're going to become carbon neutral. Is that what's driving a lot of these leadership agendas?
I hope it is. I'm very encouraged by, certainly some of the conversations coming out of the Business Roundtable and other organizations like that, where people, leaders are really thinking about what's their enduring impact on the world. And what do they want their legacy to be? Do they want to be known as like, we polluted this, or we ruined people's water supply, or, we increased inequity, or we actually did something to make the human condition better?
So let's talk about the students that come through your program. How are you evolving higher ed within your control, right?
Mm-hmm.
To really prepare them for an impactful civil impact, civil life, once they graduate, once they're gone? What are you doing, thinking differently, maybe because of this pandemic, or in general, thinking about the evolution of the market?
Yeah, so really thinking about individualized learning. So I mentioned this term civic pathways, and it's trying to do some good science to recognize what sorts of people, experiences, identities, if you will, predict what kind of outcomes for people, so that we can be more efficient about suggesting to people. I often think about, if you are an inner city kid who maybe like never traveled outside of your hometown and you come to Tufts, you're going to be looking for a different experience than somebody who was very affluent, spent your summers in Europe, or lived in, a couple different foreign countries or something like that. Now, there's going to be things that you have in common because you chose a place like Tufts and you know what the values are and you know about what the general brand of the university is. And so you'll find things in common that you'll want to work on together. But that doesn't mean we're going to say, okay, this is what our education model is, and you take these things in lockstep and we expect at the end everybody's going to come out better, right? So it's really trying to do the work to figure out what are the best practices for what kinds of people and provide more individualized learning plans for students.
So one of the things you and I talked about was this, your life of service in the military and how attractive the Tisch opportunity was and what a fabulous opportunity to give. Diane, one of the things I've noticed is I call it philanthropic fatigue. So those of us that are blessed and able to give, we try to make a difference. And it feels like a Band-Aid, right? You're giving and you give and you're fixing things, but you don't really see it changing in a more of a transformational, dynamic way. Have you seen that? And what's your response to that? Is it focus on fewer causes and make a bigger impact in that? Is it pick one and I'm going to go after something that really matters? Is it get a whole bunch of Band-Aids together and that's how we're going to stop the bleeding? Have you seen that? And what's your response to something like that?
So interestingly, like just from a very micro Tisch College perspective, I feel like we've been doing pretty well from a fundraising perspective of having people who are interested and want to contribute and think that what we're doing in terms of educating people to like give a crap, for lack of a better word, or for like seeing what their responsibility is doesn't end the day we hand you your diploma. Like you are Jumbo, that's the Tufts mascot. You are a Jumbo the day you matriculate, the day you graduate and beyond. So I often tell students, you're not my customer or my consumer, you're my product. Because what I'm teaching you in the classroom, I'm hoping you internalize that and you go out into the world and continue to use it. Like you don't forget about it the day you hand in your final paper. So I don't necessarily, if there is fatigue, I'm not 100% aware of it. I'm really encouraged by the philanthropists who have joined the Warren Buffett pledge, like to give all their money away. And I think the most recent one was the former spouse of Jeff Bezos, Mackenzie Bezos, or who has a new name now because I think she got remarried. So I can't remember what her maybe her maiden name was, but I'm encouraged by that. I don't know if I fully answered your question.
No, it's great to see examples of people that are making a fundamental difference. Switch gears with me. I love your comment of, I think I asked you on the podcast, were there some skills or knowledge that transferred from the military to what you're doing at Tisch? And I love your comment, like, is anything blowing up? Is anybody, what did you say? Limbs or sights?
Yeah, it's loss of limb or eyesight, right?
Talk about that. If that ever comes up in a meeting, I'm going to attribute it directly to you, right? Is anybody dying because of the decision we make in this meeting? Talk about that. And more importantly, I really want to talk about that unflappable kind of demeanor. Where does that come from? And how have you seen it manifest itself in great leadership?
Sure. So I feel like that was honed in the military, right? This ability to, things are blowing up around you. Like the leader cannot freak out. The leader has to be the person who remains calm. I think it was Eisenhower who talks about like leaders are dealers in hope. So you have to give people some hope that they're going to be okay, because if they think they're not going to be okay, their own survival instincts potentially kick in. So, that's one part of it. There's a gender dynamic to this too. And I will say that, there's no crying in baseball. There's really no crying in the Army either. And this kind of goes back to earlier comments about being vulnerable. Mm-hmm. So there's a time and a place for vulnerability, and times when it's okay to cry, and times when it's at least as I was growing up, it was frowned upon. And there would be times where I feel like certain people with not good intentions would enjoy seeing women sort of come unglued. And so I learned that lesson early on. I mean, I don't necessarily know if it's a healthy one. It probably helped me a little bit. My parents are Irish, and the Irish are famous for their stoicism. So there wasn't a lot of crying in my house going on either while I was growing up. So perhaps those things all helped me. So I learned how to self-regulate under stressful situations. One, for the reason it's productive in terms of keeping everybody else around you calm. And two, because there'd be some really negative consequences if I did lose it in a public setting like that. So I've been able to take that with me. People don't typically, maybe students do, but colleagues certainly, I can't think of many situations where people would be so stressed out that they'd not be able to control their emotions so much, but people do get a little bit excited and heated about things. And so times when there was some time constraint or some other crisis, if you will, I'd often say to people, all right, let's take a breath. Let's ask ourselves, like, if we don't meet this suspense today, or if we don't answer this question right now, like, what's the worst thing that's going to happen? Is anything blowing up right now? Is anyone going to lose a limb or life or eyesight? Nope. Then, okay, we have a time in the Army, we would call it a tactical pause. I also like to use the phrase, take a knee and drink some water. Because that's another, kind of military phrase that people know what that means. So if you're actually like out in the field, take a knee, drink some water means like you got to remember to hydrate. You got to remember to take a breath, stop and think, like check your surroundings. So all of those things to be more mindful, I think have been helpful.
Talk about. I love your George Bernard Shaw quote of the Splendid Torch poem. Mm-hmm. And you specifically brought it around to the incredible leader Frances Hasselbaum has been, mm-hmm. and at 105 continues to be, which is the amazing part, right? I think if any of us contribute an ounce of what the woman has done for Girl Scouts and West mm-hmm. Point and all the things she's involved in, I think we can call it a life well earned. Talk about that. Talk about this calling you've had to serve. Mm-hmm. Talk about what you saw as the right type of model leadership behaviors from Frances mm-hmm. and from others that have kind of shaped, Diane, who you've become.
All right, this is my favorite question because I'm talking about my, one of my favorite people on the planet, probably in my top 3 of favorite people, not counting my kids. So I met Frances when I first arrived at West Point, but I knew of her sort of reputation prior to that because our mutual colleague Tom Kolditz, who was my boss at the time, asked me to put together an award packet for her for this really prestigious award. And we had letters from Alan Mulally, CEO of Ford. We had certainly a letter from Marshall Goldsmith, a letter from Bill Clinton, who had given her the Presidential Medal of Freedom. So many, I mean, the book was like that thick by the time I was done, because everybody wanted to write a letter for Frances and say how amazing she was and all how important her contributions were. And so a few months go by and she's coming to visit the campus. Now, this is before she was our leadership chair, so I hadn't yet met her. And so I'm escorting her, we're driving somewhere and having this conversation about how much we love our jobs and, you know, the things that we're doing. And I've always prided myself on my work ethic. I inherited it from my parents. I want people to say about me that I'm a very hard worker. I may not be the most talented person, but like nobody is going to outlast me in terms of effort, right? I'm always trying to make sure, you know, that I have given the best I can possibly give. And so I said to her, and I've always, every single job I've had in the Army, and, you know, we change every year or 2 years, I've worked myself out of. Like I worked up until the day I was done. And then I probably still had a few things that I was sending back to people. I was not one of these people who said, oh, I'm a short timer. I have 60 days left. I'm kind of done working. I'll just like leave this for the next person. It's just not in my DNA. So I made a comment to Frances, oh, I'm a workaholic like you. And she like shot daggers out of her eyes at me. And she was like, there is no such thing as a workaholic. There are people who live to work. And there are people that work to live, meaning they just work so they can get a paycheck and like have their basic necessities. And then there are people who live to work. And she said, you and I live to work because we just picked something that we think is meaningful and we love to do. And, you know, her motto is to serve is to live. And I've truly come to believe that. Like the times when I feel like I'm at my best is when someone says, can they have some help with something? And I'm able to contribute something that somehow makes a positive difference.
You brought up Tom, and I think he's recently written a book, and he talks a lot about leadership and civic life, and how much of what you learned, what you taught at West Point, are you carrying through? And I know you do a lot of executive education courses, and how much of it is that is transferable? If I've never served, if I don't know anything about a military life, are there some relevant transferable skills in my ability to lead my organization in a civic, responsible manner?
Yeah, I would say the answer to that is definitely yes. So certainly some of the process things that we learn in the military about, you know, structures that help people communicate better, that help to instill like a better culture and climate are all things, you know, certainly working across diverse populations. I mean, I came from a place that I don't think in my town there was a single person of color. I probably never met a person who had fundamentally different experiences from me until not even so much in college. It was really through the military connection. I mean, I went to a college that was predominantly white Irish Catholic people. And so my exposure to working with people that had very different life experiences was all through the Army. And so all of those things I learned about being adaptable and flexible, dealing with stress, are all things that I can directly trace back to some origin of my time in uniform for the most part, you know, as well as childhood value systems as well. So, you know, I found it to be really, really relevant as long as you can translate it in a way that people understand. So one of the funniest things that people used to say to me all the time when I came to Tufts, nobody says it to me anymore because they know better, but they would say, well, you know, the faculty here are not like the people at West Point. You just can't order them around and tell them what to do. And I don't know that I've ever really done that in my life. maybe there were times where I would say to people, okay, you can complain about something 3 times, and then the 3rd time when I tell you to do it, you have to do it, because it's a direct order. But for the most part, I tried to be a consensus builder, because you just get a lot more commitment from people when you take their ideas and their concerns and their values into account as you're trying to go out and accomplish something.
Just to build on that, do you believe a leader can overdo it on the consensus building part?
Yes. And that's why I said I do the 3. I used to, like in Iraq, this became a thing. I don't have to say a bad word, but I'd call it the theory of the 3 bitches, right? Or the policy of 3 bitches. So you could bitch about something 3 times. Like you could complain, this is a bad idea because, this is a bad idea because, and if by the 3rd time I haven't, I'm not able to accommodate your input, you just have to do it.
Got it.
Now, if there were times where,
does that also work with our teenagers, by the way? I'm just asking. I'm asking for
we don't want to go there. The leadership lessons of things that I learned that work, in these education settings and whatever, that don't necessarily translate into the family. Although my kids are, now that my oldest is 21 and she's graduating college, and she's starting to get it.
Yeah.
And she will say like, oh, I remember when you told me about this, and now I understand what you meant by that. So that's mildly encouraging.
That's awesome. And again, in the podcast we talked about, did you really take the kids with cadets to, what did you say, basketball tournaments and leadership programs and stuff?
Yep. So this is the idea of work-life integration. So if there was a thing that I had to do that was part of my faculty responsibilities, I would figure out a way to work my family into it to the greatest extent possible. So we had season tickets for like all these different sports things. So I was the faculty rep for the women's basketball team. So my kids sat courtside for 7 seasons, I think. They, more or less grew up in that arena. Twice we went to the NCAA tournament. We went to the WNIT. My kids came on those bus trips and like got to experience what that was like, to be in those arenas and see what hard work and, can accomplish, and teamwork and, being part of something bigger than yourself. And those lessons, I think, were enduring for them.
What a great, talk about courtside experience for them to see that and see those cadets succeed, not just in a place like West Point, but also in life, and really learn a lot of those attributes that carried with them. You and I met through the Marshall Goldsmith MG100. Talk about that experience. What has that done for you as a leader? And I know Marshall asks all of us to kind of pay it forward. How are you paying that forward?
So hopefully I'm not done, not even scratch the surface of paying it forward, but it has really, it came at such an important time in my life. I joined MG100 in the summer of 2017, like right as I was leaving the Army. And I had only had one job, more or less, one employer. I had lots of different jobs, but I had one employer for my entire life. So to go into this really diverse group of quite brilliant people who were all motivated by the idea of helping others was just, talk about a curve bender in terms of having this whole new community of just incredible people. And I've met some wonderful friends, present company included, and lifelong friends, and people who have really challenged my thinking, helped to bring resources into my classroom, into the work that we're doing at Tisch College. And I couldn't be more grateful to Marshall and all the people behind the scenes that make that possible.
If for our audience, if you've joined us late, you're listening to Diane Ryan, Colonel, retired U.S. Army and Associate Dean for Programs and Administration at Tisch College at Tufts University. Diane, let's talk about, again, future of work. How do you believe your role at Tisch and this idea of really making a difference in civil life will evolve I'm going to ask you to take out your crystal ball and extrapolate some of the stuff you're doing now. I think you recently taught a class. And how will your role evolve in the next decade? What are you most excited about? What are you most looking forward to?
So, I mean, there are people like higher ed's done, the pandemic means the end of higher ed, and, colleges and universities in the United States have endured for, 400 years or something. So I don't think they're going away, but I think they definitely are going to expand and evolve in how they deliver material. There's a lot of people who I think ascribe to the idea that, like you mentioned this before, you just go, you get the skills and the knowledge that you need so you can do a job and earn a living. But I think people are looking for more than that, and they're looking for like whole person experiences. So learning things, certainly I'm approaching from like a liberal arts standpoint. So learning things and, strengthening your values and figuring out how to bring your best self out into the world to positively contribute to society. And that is not to say that more technical environments like engineering schools and things like that don't need this information or don't need these abilities also. I mean, I absolutely think that civic education is integral. It starts before, I have to say though, it does start before college. Like, we got to get a handle on this in our public school system as well, or in K through 12. And I know recently 2 of my colleagues at Tisch College were co-authors on the Educating for American Democracy roadmap that rolled out the beginning of March at the Smithsonian. So, helping people in K through 12 figure out what are the best, most important skills, and then building on that in college and beyond, to have these concepts follow you through your whole life, I think is really important. So that's certainly the civic side of this. I do feel like maybe the traditional 4-year brick and mortar is going to go through some challenges as well. It won't cease to exist because it's not a terrible thing for a kid to have a supportive environment, from 18 to 22 or whatever, where they get to go experience being independent, and a self-directed learner and not under the watchful eye of their parents, and have these experiences. But we got to build on that and provide more flexibility and adaptability. Again, thinking back to what I said earlier about individualizing things. So providing people different pathways to, get to the end that they want to be at.
So what you're really saying is that there is some hope that the kids will actually get off the books at some point in the future. Is that I'm trying to just understand. There's some glimmer of hope in kids getting off the book.
So I read an article this week that said you should be prepared to pay for your kids' cell phone, and they'll be mooching off like your Netflix and your Hulu subscriptions and all those things forever. I don't know if that's true or not.
Parenting session brought to you by. Before I ask you how our audience can get in touch with you or learn more about your work, I got to tell you, I love the story of your dad. And again, my dad, for our audience may know, they still live in Iran. My dad's well in his 80s, and there's this hero status. I mean, we all put our parents in such a high pedestal, but you've got a fascinating story about your dad. When I asked you who had a profound impact on you and your values, tell your dad's story for a second.
Sure. So I grew up believing my dad was larger than life because he was 6'5". He was a very large man. But there was a period in my life, probably around my teenage years, and it persisted well past college. His job was a bus driver. He drove a bus for the local transit authority. And there came a point where I started doing like the left and right comparison and thinking like, he'd only finished the 9th grade and he was constantly like pounding the education drum and telling us how important it was to do well in school. And when you're a teenager, you think like, you quit school in the 9th grade. Why are you busting my chops over my grade and whatever? Or why are you pushing me to go to these, apply to these prestigious colleges and so forth? And so I didn't have a good appreciation for my dad in the context of a leader beyond, he's a good father and good provider. And so he died kind of suddenly when I was in my 30s. And actually reflecting on a story that Frances tells about her childhood and her grandparents, one day just like made me remember this event and how impactful and how it kind of defines my life and how I want to be thought of. So at his funeral, we noticed out of the corner of our eye a woman with Down syndrome that none of us knew personally, and we couldn't figure out why she was at my father's funeral. And then at the very end of the service, the funeral director brought this young woman by the hand up in front of the family, and it said, this is Karen, and she would like to read something. And she opens up this letter, and it's a letter to my father about he was like the best bus driver in the world. And every day he took her to her job at Burger King and always made her feel like she did a great job and, how much she was going to miss him. And, it was very powerful in the moment. And then I forgot about it for a little while. And then reflecting on, as I think about how you develop yourself as a leader, understanding your journey and the things that have made you the way you are is really important. So one day I'm at a conference and this young woman says to me, like, I feel like I don't belong here, imposter syndrome. She said it was a conference for college students who had to apply. It was very competitive. She said, I'm around all these people who've created their own nonprofits. They're like president of their student senate. I'm none of those things. I don't know why I'm here. And how do you know if you're a good enough leader? And I thought of this story of Karen coming to my father's funeral and saying like, what an important thing he provided, the motivation and literally getting her from one place to another, providing direction to her. And it caused me to have an epiphany of what my father really set a strong foundation for how I should behave around other people and treating people with dignity and respect and having a strong work ethic and just like being there for people is really the essence of, how I want to be remembered.
I love the story the first time I heard it, and second time it's even more profound. So thank you for the gift of your time. Thank you for all that you do, not just at Tisch, but with others. I've observed you kind of guide and mentor and coach. And I can't even imagine all the cadets that you're able to influence. And I love your description of students as products because you pour into them, hoping that likewise they create enormous value in others. Diane, what's the best way for our audience to learn more about you and your work?
At the Tisch College website, which I think if you just go to tufts.edu and search for Jonathan M. Tisch College, I should be on there.
Perfect. For our audience, again, you've been listening to Diane Ryan, who's Associate Dean of Programs and Administration, Tisch College at Tufts University. She's a friend. She's an MG 100 colleague. And we had a great podcast conversation this morning. And the title of it is The Splendid Torch. So I hope you'll check that out. nourgroup.com/podcast. We'll also share links of it here. And I would welcome you to continue the conversation. We're in the Nour Forum community on a daily basis, and we host each weekly podcast guest on Tuesdays at noon Eastern. Diane, great to see you, and look forward to our next interaction.
Me too. Thanks. This was fun.
Take care.
Bye-bye.